So today, we are only going to be talking about rights and treated fairly. So we've got some time for questions. It was a very interesting discussion on Tuesday. So keep in mind, we've got just a little bit extra time for this. Here we go into rights. I again am going to read this to you. You have the handouts, I hope. And going forward with Joe. Joe has no guardian, health proxy, or power of attorney. The Human Rights Committee reviews the above areas on an annual basis. The organization has sought to find a suitable advocate for Joe, but has not been able to do so. There is no family member who will be willing to take on the role of advocate, champion, or guardian. The Human Rights Committee also reviews Joe's anti-anxiety medication, as the organization sees that medication as a chemical restriction. The committee is thorough with any issue regarding legal, chemical, and mechanical restrictions. Joe has not needed any surgeries nor other procedures that would require additional consent. Joe shows his displeasure by crying and making a high-pitched noise. Staff are all aware of his language and are intentional in sharing that information. Adjustments are made as preferences are identified. Excuse me. The organization conducts an annual assessment of rights with Joe. However, staff indicate he does not seem interested in that conversation, but believe they would know if something was wrong. With that being said, we move on to the decision-making questions. Does Joe exercise any of the rights in the following area? And we are on page 31 in the manual. For possessions and wages, all of those, I won't read those to you. In addition, are there any other rights that are limited or restricted? For each of the rights that Joe does not exercise, who most limits those abilities? And for each of the rights that Joe does not exercise, was adequate due process provided? If each right in number 5 is yes, the outcome is present. For all rights not exercised, if due to informed personal choice or the limitations are approved with adequate due process, the outcome is present. With that, we will go to the poll, Kathy.
People are voting. 29% of the folks have voted.
About 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's close the poll.
So, Jill, it's a pretty split group. We have 40% saying yes, the outcome is present, and 58% saying no, the outcome is not present.
58%
are saying no.
Okay, the outcome, we have discussed this, and according to the decision-making questions, we would say that the outcome is not present. Although the organization has an assessment that they complete annually, there are still limits on legal rights. If you look at it for money, for the representative payee to have been imposed without due process, meaning the Human Rights Committee, and they're doing some things, but they're not seeing, if you look at it, they're not seeing that some of these things are identified. They're assuming consent when they're not really sure. If he doesn't seem interested, what other things are they doing? Is the assessment the right assessment to be using? And a number of things for that. Any questions? No questions? We had a few from Tuesday. None that you're seeing, Kathy?
No, no, not yet.
Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about the impact that guardianship has on this. If he had a guardian, what would be different?
Right. If he had a guardian, that would be considered adequate due process, because that would have gone through the courts. We would still want Joe to be informed and educated and doing a comprehensive rights review with folks, and continuing to look at that, but that would have been considered due process in this particular case. And again, one of the questions for personal possessions, had that guardian been, well, I may just confuse it, but had the guardian also been the representative payee, it still would have needed to be some human rights, that third party due process. In your manual, also, when you're looking at this, we look at adequate due processes, which is on page 29 in your manual, that helps give some clarification to what that due process is that must be present for this outcome to be present. We continue to look at every restriction as a temporary restriction, and in saying so, we would expect that there would be a pretty comprehensive review of those restrictions to find the areas that could be lessened, where Joe could take over some of the things instead of just kind of saying he's not interested.
So Joe, we have a question now. If someone has a power of attorney, is that reviewed by the Human Rights Committee?
The power of attorney power of attorney is usually a power that is given by the person, with fully informed choice about that. If it was an assigned position, yes, it would still need to be. Is certainly a pretty robust conversation about what that means to people and keeping them educated on that. Kathy, anything else?
No, I think that it is. The power of attorney is somebody that's appointed by the person. So if it's the person's informed choice, then it would not need to be reviewed. If there was some concern on the part of the team or other people who were involved in the person's life that wasn't a free choice that was made, then of course you might have some other obligations. So the same question about rep payee. Is the expectation that if somebody has a rep payee that needs to be reviewed by this third party, this Human Rights Committee?
Yes. The representative payee, again, if the guardian is the representative payee, we would see that as kind of lumped together, and they would still be part of that guardianship. And so you would want to know, you would want to read the guardianship papers to see exactly what it is, because from state to state, it varies greatly on what the states and the judges actually request and require for that. We always look that the guardian is there, of course, to guard people's rights and not to usurp any of those rights. So if the representative payee would be the organization or someone other than the guardian, yes. And if it was the guardian, it would still be reviewed under that guardianship.
Okay, thanks. So this person writes, I've been given different answers related to legal guardianship and the right to vote, as well as to involve oneself in an intimate personal relationship. Could we clarify?
I see. Again, you would need to, there are so many different ones, and if a parent is the guardian or someone else is the guardian and making those decisions, it's really state by state and person by person, depending on the state and the jurisdiction that you're in and the judges that are looking at it. Some states just have a kind of general overview of restriction of people, so they just put in a code number and say this is the code that we're going to do, and it's got lots of restrictions, but there are also responsibilities of the guardian for that. So we would be the advocate at that point to try and educate and find those answers to what the person particularly wants, and then advocate for them.
Thank you. And I'll just add, Jill, if you don't mind, that, again, the laws are so different in the state of Missouri, which is where, I've done most of my direct support work. The guardianship law didn't allow somebody who had a legal guardian to vote. Now the law reads as if the guardian can give that person that right. So, you have to look at the state laws. They vary greatly. And so that may explain why there's sometimes some differences in that. And the same with intimate personal relationships. So the next question is, so for Joe, what kinds of things could the agency do to make sure that its rights are advocated for?
Well, when we're talking about that, of course, it's educating your staff and training and talking to Joe and really being robust with someone, especially that doesn't use words to communicate, so that we are always interpreting. And so there could be ways we need to just make sure that we don't lose any of the interests or any of the things that Joe might indicate that he wants to do. Access to food, having his visitors, the personal decision making, which is in here. There are all sorts of things about personal decision making, and that's probably where we would look with Joe as to what is the organization actually doing to keep that communication log going. So Joe doesn't have to retrain everyone as new people come into his life.
Okay. And so if Joe was taking a medication, or someone was taking a medication and the person also had a psychiatric diagnosis, does the HRC need to review this if the person is okay with it?
So not for Joe. Organization, the codes basically say that the federal codes do not say that we have to do that. I have found that most organizations go ahead and do that anyway, just to kind of look at that they've given the Human Rights Committee that oversight of that, of the medications, of the perhaps behavior. Well, maybe not a behavior plan because it's a diagnosis. But just to make sure that things are on the right track, that they've given that oversight to Human Rights Committee. We know that it says if it's a true diagnosis, it doesn't need to have a behavior support plan or a support communication plan, but mostly it's a good idea to have some sort of oversight on that.
Okay. And then just to be sure, if somebody has a POA, a rep payee, and our guardianship, all right, so I'm going to read it just as it is, just to make sure I'm clear. POA, rep payee, and a guardianship does not need to go through HR. And I would say that that's not at all what we're saying.
No, it does need to go through.
So so going back to the question about advocacy, in terms of, we had said in the scenario, so I'm rephrasing this so that I try to make it clearer. So we had said that the agency had worked really hard to find someone to be an advocate for Joe, but they couldn't find anybody. So it appeared that the agency did everything they could to find Joe an advocate. So what else would they need to do in order for this outcome to be present?
They haven't found one yet. We would expect that does not just stop because of whatever time frame that they have done it. That they would continue to do that. And then the Human Rights Committee would be the one, and all the other advocates, because we're all advocates, we're all self-advocates, to continue to search for someone that would want to be a part of that. The outcome may never be present for him. If everyone is saying that he really does need someone to assist him and be his advocate in these areas, we would look at the processes for the support then.
Right. So the process of finding an advocate really is part of the support decision and not necessarily the outcome decision. The outcome decision is really about whether or not his rights are protected.
Yes.
Right. Does that make sense to the person? If it didn't, please ask again. So, apparently there was a conversation at a personal outcome measure training that was done recently that something wouldn't necessarily need to be considered a restriction if the person didn't feel like they were being restricted. Is this accurate?
It would depend very specifically, and we would have to do a lot of discussion about what that restriction was. I mean, if I self-restrict, and I don't consider that a restriction, I just consider that if I smoke and I decide to just smoke 10 cigarettes a day instead of 2 packs, that's my decision. If I say, okay, it's okay for you all to hold my cigarettes and keep me to 5 a day, and I'm not allowed, if you will, a 6th one, even when I ask, that is a restriction. It's kind of that support and restriction. Go ahead.
Right. So, Jill, I would agree with you. And I think, sometimes the discussion that we get into is about when is it a support and when is it a restriction.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, I was at an agency not too long ago, and they were talking about this person would say, oh, I wasn't safe on my bike, so we should lock my bike up in the shed for now. If the bike gets locked in the shed and at his request, then at his request he should be able to get that back. So if he says to you, I want my bike back today, and it's not been locked up for as long as he said he wanted it locked up for, then that makes it become a restriction. Does that make sense? So it's very much like the cigarettes. If I'm asking for support, and so I want you to hold my cigarettes for me, but as soon as you say, no, you can't have them back, it's now turned into not my choice. Okay. So I hope that answers that.
Yeah, we started years ago when we've talked about the difference between a support and a restraint on a wheelchair even. So I use a wheelchair, and I'm okay. I want the seatbelt because it makes me feel really secure. But if somehow that latch goes around to the back and I can't open it, it becomes a restriction. It's not my support any longer because I can't change it.
Right. Good. So it was our understanding during our accreditation review last year that it was required that someone who is on psychotropic medication with a matching diagnosis needed to go through the Human Rights Committee. Is that correct? So somebody who has a psychotropic medication and a diagnosis still.
It is suggested that it is, that there again, I don't want to contradict anyone, and maybe we need to talk about that specifically. It's that we review any restrictions, but the psychotropic medication with a confirmed diagnosis, we always suggest that it would be seen by a third party, wherever that is, whatever that might be.
So I believe, right. So Joe, you're saying the same thing they understood during their 2017 review,
yes,
that it should go through the Human Rights Committee. So that is correct.
It is suggested, yes.
Okay. What about locked money or having a payee? Does that need to, I think the question is, does that need to be reviewed by a Human Rights Committee?
Yes. The short answer.
Okay.
Unless I say, I can't handle my money, would you please hold it for me? But then again, that discussion goes further that says, how much do you want? What are we doing to educate? How are we doing that? Can I keep it locked in my own room? Can I keep my meds locked in my own room? You know, it goes beyond, I'm sorry, just the short answer, but if that's the question and that's all the information I would have, I would say yes.
Okay. All right, good. We just have one more question and then we can move on, I think. So it seems that the agency, and this is going back again to the thing, they've done everything they can about the advocacy. So it just seems that the agency will be penalized even after they have done all they can to help Joe get an advocate.
No, because the outcome would not be present, but when we go on to the supports here between rights and treated fairly, there would be if it was ongoing and you didn't, and the agency just didn't throw their hands up and say, oops, we can't find anyone, that we would continuously, and not nag people and not just go out on the street to find someone, but to find someone that has a connection with Joe that might be wanting to do that. So the outcome would not be there, and there's no penalty for an outcome not being there, nor is there a penalty for support not being there. It's just it just is what it is. So the support may indeed be present because you continue to look for someone. Or there's a group of people that maybe one person doesn't want to do it, but a couple people would be willing to like talk to him and be his advocate outside of the agency purview.
So again, let's just remember, everybody, that the outcome belongs to the person. The support looks at quality of services and what the agency is doing. So, you know, you have to keep those two things separate. There may be things that you're doing that go above and beyond what you know other agencies would do, but that if the person's outcome has to be there no matter what we're doing. But the supports could be in place, whether they are or not in this particular situation we're going to talk about now.
Good segue. So we would go on to the supports of this, and if you have your manual, we are on page 31. The individualized support questions for Joe and his rights are Joe's preferences and desires about the exercise of rights solicited by the organization. Have the rights that are important to Joe been identified, or are efforts being made to learn about Joe's preferences? Is the person provided with the support needed to exercise his rights? And the poll will begin. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Poll close.
So Jill, and looking at this one again, we 21% of the folks of us believe that the supports are in place. We would determine that based on the information we have. The rest would determine that they're not in place, and there are 19% developing plans, 40% aware but really have no plans, and 19% would say, nope, not in place at all.
Okay. And we're looking at these. So the majority of you did decide that the supports were not wholly in place for Joe, and that is correct. The supports are not in place holistically for Joe when it comes to his rights. We know that there are a couple things present, and so we've got some awareness. We've got a couple things developing, but on the whole, it's not in place with the issue of representative payee. There are some supports and the identified of ongoing efforts to learn about his preferences. There are some nice little R's and big R's. Those of you that have been through the training, we talk about the little R's, the daily niceties, the daily are you okay, the daily, all of those things. But when we look at the big R's of those true preferences that are important, those rights, if you go back to the rights list plus everything else, that the assessments don't seem to be robust enough. And if he does need a advocate, guardian, power of attorney or something, what are we doing to really find that for him to guard his rights? Questions?
So if we go back to the question about advocacy, tell us a little bit how that would influence the support to make the decision about the supports.
If there was some pretty heavy duty, I don't mean to, I over exaggerate things, but those advocacy efforts, it could be an advocacy group that the organization has to double check on these things for people who do not have guardians, but that the team has identified as in need of some decision-making supports, whatever that would be. And so there might be, I've seen organizations do that, put together kind of an advocacy consent or an advocacy champion team that would look at that for certain individuals. That might be one step. I mean, there are numbers of different things. You know, always going to a state advocacy doesn't really give, or a state guardianship doesn't really, aren't always true advocates, but rather just signing for people. And it's like, where do we find those people that do that? So if that was in place and they were completely aware of all of the rights issues and were really robust about that, it could have gone to, still not in place yet, but certainly aware and they're developing those plans.
Okay, thanks. So in this particular instance with Joe, this person would wonder what evidence that the organization has that has really identified what Joe's real risks are rather than what might be an imagined risk.
That's a really good question. And I think that there are risk assessments and safety assessments that go along with a rights assessment that are in place, that many places that I've been to recently have been doing both of those things. So, or a combined issue of that, so that we're certainly looking at the rights, and that will come up in his safety of whether he's safe when we get to that point for that outcome. But that could certainly identify some of those things for rights also.
So, Joe, could you talk a little bit about due process and what that means in terms of guardianship? You know, because due process talks about everything being temporary and there being some supports in place to reduce that restriction. So what kinds of things would you expect to see for people who had rep payees or people who had difficulty making decisions independently?
We would be looking for those less intrusive interventions that have been tried, or how are we on an ongoing basis making sure that rights are not being limited because someone is I've lost the word, that a person has not been appointed by the court and is still making kind of legal decisions for the person. So we want to know what is it that the organization does in training, education, systems, and procedures to support the rights of people. We would certainly want to see their policies and make sure that their procedures match those, or vice versa.
Okay, thank you. So that looks like it for the questions right now. But I wonder if you could just talk, I'll give you another question that might be helpful for people. Talk a little bit about informed decision making and what is included in informed decision making.
Well, we always talk about, informed knowledge-based decision making. In Joe's particular case, of course, we're advocating for him and interpreting for him. So it's going to be a longer process than someone that we have educated on. They know all of their options. They know what their rights are and their legal and civil and personal freedoms are in order to make decisions about it. We've done everything that we can possibly do to inform them, and they make the decision. It might not be the decision that we want them to make, but this comes up a lot in monies, rights, personal freedoms of intimate relationships, and what do we do to cause no harm?
The other question that just popped up is, could you talk a little bit more about what a good rights assessment might include, or what other kinds of things you would be looking at? We've talked about risk assessments, but could you talk about what other things you'd be looking at in terms of rights assessments or decision making?
Well, there are all sorts of rights rights assessments online. I don't have one right in front of me. Alabama was doing some nice things on rights in conjunction with people supported across the state, and that is on their website. And it's a free download, and they did that within their organization. A rights assessment, there are those basic civil rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the UN Convention. It has a lot of those things, but we look at our legal and civil, and we just, it's not that we have to do massive training on these all the time, but it might not be those rights that the person identifies as their most important. The right to communicate with their family and be a part of their family might be their most important right. And so we want to make sure that that is taken into consideration. So it's a continuous sort of journey with that, pictures and different media. There are rights and responsibilities. There are videotapes or DVDs out there that have all sorts of kind of training things. We have CQL actually is rolling out a rights card game that seems to be really well accepted by folks, that is kind of a game to talk about rights that you can bring in your staff and the people supported into really thinking about what those are. Those assessments will have to be determined by your organization, but there are lots of them out there. Just remember that, there are those individual rights that people see as most important that we want to include in that assessment.
Okay, then I think it's time to move on.
Excellent. We're on to treated fairly. People are treated fairly. The outcome measure number 5. The house that Joe lives in with 5 other men has several house rules. Included are alarms on exit entry doors because one man will leave the house without telling anyone. Another is that sharps are locked in the kitchen because a housemate has hurt himself with a knife in the past. No one can take food from the refrigerator without staff being present because a housemate takes others' snack items. The men only eat and drink at the dining room table. The staff said this is to prevent bug infestation and minimize the risk for spills in other parts of the home. Staff stated that none of these rules bothered Joe, and he doesn't fuss about anything. And since he doesn't fuss, the organization does not view these as restrictions, and that Joe is giving consent. The organization is the representative payee for all people in residential services provided to ensure that everyone's money is safe and secure. Financial assessment indicates that Joe is unable to manage his own monies as he does not understand the meaning of money. The organization views this service as a support, not a restriction. With that, we will go to the outcome questions. Have fair treatment or rights limitations been identified? And that's by and on behalf of. If the answer to 6.1 is yes, for each rights limitation identified in the exercise rights section, was adequate due process provided? In addition, are there other rights that are limited or restricted? If so, was adequate due process provided? For any fair treatment issue, was the issue addressed so the person's concerns were resolved to their satisfaction? If the answers to 6.2 and 6.3 are yes, the outcome is present. Poll is open. About 10 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Poll is closed.
So, Jill, overwhelmingly, 89% of the people on the call said no, treated fairly, the outcome is not present. 11% said yes, it is present.
Well done, 89, and well done, 11. We will talk about it a little bit. It is not present. You are correct. There are a number of reasons. Again, those temporary restrictions, reviews, the house rules, although some restrictions may be supports, they must still be seen as restrictions as it cannot be determined that Joe is giving informed consent and no legal representative for informed consent. We cannot at this time identify adequate due process for those house rules that it was or was not provided through Human Rights Committee. We know that the chemical and mechanical and psychotropic medical things went through the Human Rights Committee in the last outcome, but not for treated fairly. Any questions? We want to make sure that those house rules, so when you're talking to people, you know, a good way with those treated fairly things is to talk about, you know, what are the house rules? Do you have house rules? And many times I will hear, no, we don't. And it's like, okay, well, where do you eat? And they start to come out by just kind of talking about what freedoms people have in their own homes, especially in congregate living homes. I mean, Joe lives with 5 other people, so you know there's 6 people in this area. Some of those things I also want to address, that the house rules kind of become those blanket statements for people, and we don't, and we never look at a blanket rule as something that is person-centered or person-directed or individualized.
So, Jill, there are 2 questions so far.
Right.
One is about when I went through this training a long time ago, I thought that the person had to identify the fair treatment issues, and if there weren't any identified by the person, the outcome was present. Has something changed?
We're talking about for Joe in particular, who has advocates. I'm sorry, who has interpreters for him. It could be identified by a rights or a fair treatment by or on behalf of the person. If Joe has that high-pitched screaming when a certain roommate or housemate, I'm sorry, is around them, it might be a fair treatment issue that we would identify for him, and that we would take action on for him.
Okay, all right, thanks. And then the other question is, in terms of, you know, what we know about Joe from last webinar, when you told us about his behavior and concerns about somebody else that he lives with, could that be a complaint that would be considered here?
It could be. That's a very good point. It could have been in the right section when we're looking at, yes. It's a good point. I should have added that to it. It certainly could be, because we look, when we're looking at basic assurances, what is the complaint and grievance process also? So it would be in here too for treated fairly. Most certainly it could have been. It would have been identified here. Thank you.
Okay, so could you discuss the connection between his rights outcome not being present and how that affects the outcome for treated fairly?
Well, in this particular case, it's that Human Rights Committee and that third party looking at it. Had those been in place, let's just say that he had a guardian and he had a representative payee that had both been through Human Rights Committee, and that all that was all done with that. We would continue to look at the rights limitations or fair treatment issues in these other areas. So if those all being perfect or all being reviewed, it would still be the house rules and those sort of things that would be brought up in the treated fairly. That might be a treated fairly as opposed to a actual right. It could be a personal freedom or something that they don't see as fair. I'm not sure that I answered the question, but
so there's not. Is it possible that these outcomes could be different? That
yes.
That
yes.
You know, treated exercising rights could be present and treated fairly couldn't be, or vice versa.
Yes.
There is another question that I'm asking someone to rephrase. So if we could just talk for a minute and see if I can get some clarification, that would be helpful. In the meantime, could you talk a little bit about kind of what are some best practices around supporting people to learn skills that might reduce their dependence on either things like money restrictions or decision-making restrictions?
Wow, there's all sorts of things. You know, we really want to look at the person's learning style and figuring out, let's just take money for an example of a restriction with the lock boxes and the monies. I'm seeing more and more debit cards being used, not for everybody's full monies, but it's a start. We don't want to stop doing something because we can't get to the end by next year. But rather, is it that we make sure that we have all $1 bills for me instead of giving me 5s and 10s? Is it that I actually just know that there's a barter system that I need to give something to get something? Are there is it a partial thing? Counting 10 pennies to make a dime is, or even identifying all the coins isn't always what the person wants by having access to their money. And so we really need to find out what that is. Where other people want their whole box, they want all their money, and most people aren't their own representative payee at this point. So everything's not coming to them, but simply because they have a disability and simply because they are receiving services from an organization, sorry about that, it does not necessarily mean that they need a representative payee either.
Okay, so maybe we could go on to the next.
Certainly. For the supports for treated fairly, the questions are, has the organization solicited information about rights violations or fair treatment issues from Joe? Have procedures for adequate due process for any identified rights limitations been implemented? Are the procedures used by the organization consistent with due process principles? And does the organization respond to the person's fair treatment issues to address any concerns? Based on the answers, are individualized supports in place to facilitate this outcome for Joe? poll is up. Almost. Okay. Just a few more seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So it looks like most of us said the supports are not in place. 2% said yes. The rest said no. Some believe there are some plans being developed. Some say there's some awareness, but no plans. But most people say, 68% say, no, there's nothing in place really.
Right. And again, the developing plans, aware but no plans, and not in place, and Kathy can talk about this too, is that most of you are aware that it's not in place. There might be some developing plans. They're taking a look at it, but the organization must have procedures in place for adequate due process for and on behalf of every person. The principles for the organization to have this in place are that the review of limitations to personal freedoms, locked, sharps, refrigerator, food at table only, provide training and support so that limitations can be reversed or removed, and to review and change policies and procedures that limit or restrict people in a blanket umbrella sort of way. So there might be some things in there, but most importantly, it is not in place in the robust way that we would look for an individualized support to be in place for Joe.
There aren't any questions. I think, it's important, and we talked about it last month on the call too, that really we put in place the 3 different variations on no: developing plans, aware but no plans, and not in place, to help agencies judge and see that they could make progress rather than just it being a simple yes, no. When we do come in and do the assessments, we're really looking at whether it is in place or it's not in place, and not at those different variations. And so, while you might be able to make an argument that there are some things in place or being developed, sometimes when an outcome, when a support is not present, there are some things in place, but the outcome still isn't, the support still isn't robust enough. Maybe it's not, happening that maybe they just started. Maybe there are different things that happened, or they put somebody on a waiting list, and so that there's some action, but nothing's happened. So just, to remind people about that.
If there are no further questions, I just want to thank you all and thank Kathy, and just to remember that this is a continuing journey. We've not met our destination, and I thank you for all your input and your questions. It always gives me time to pause and think, and so that we know that we're in this together. So if you have any additional things that you want to discuss with Kathy and I on a more singular, individualized level, there are our emails. And I thank you for your time today. Hope to see you next month.
Thank you, Jill. Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day.